Yes, I think that first of all, your description is correct, James. There is a war on cash, if you want to use that phrase, but certainly governments around the world are doing everything possible to suppress and diminish the use of cash. So that's just a fact. Taking it a step further, where you're going with that, where do you want to end up? The answer is a completely digital world. We're just about there already, by the way. The last U.S. Treasury bond that was issued in paper format, I believe it was 1979. So maybe someone's grandmother has one in her attic with some little coupons attached, but the treasury market has been completely digital since 1980. The overwhelming majority of payments are all digital. You get your paycheck or royalties or whatever it is, it's all wired to your bank account, et cetera. We use credit cards, debit cards. So that's all digital already, but there is cash still around, and people use it. I tell people when you put your money in the bank, it's not your money anymore, it's the bank's money, and they'll give it to you if they feel like it, and sometimes they don't. And that comes as a shock to most people. In the United States, we have a couple of particular laws. If let's say you have 100,000 in the bank, okay, so you go down and say, well, I'd like 100,000 in cash, please, just stacks of $100 bills, put it in the briefcase. They'll tell you to come back. They'll tell you to make an appointment. We don't have that much cash. Make an appointment, come back in a few days. You do. You probably have to bring like your birth certificate or passport and all kinds of other identification under know your customer rules, et cetera. They'll give it to you. They'll file what's called a CTR, currency transaction report. It goes to something called the Financial Crimes Enforcement Network, FinCEN, down near Washington. So the word crime is in the title of the agency. You'll be put in a file, a couple of drawers down from Osama bin Laden, as the case may be. And you say, well, okay, I can work around that. I'll just get 9,000 because 10,000 is the trigger. We'll do that twice in a row. That's a suspicious activity. And they file what's called a suspicious activity report, SAR, because you look like you're structuring. In the drug smuggling days, well, I guess we're still here. They call it smurfing, but basically breaking up the withdrawals into small pieces below the 10,000 threshold. Well, they catch that. It's all automated, of course, and they'll file a report for that. So this is, I'm sure other countries around the world, UK and others have similar rules. So the war on cash is real. They're moving forward. The one facet of that's a different topic, but related, are central bank digital currencies. There's a lot of confusion about that for two reasons. One, people say, oh, they're cryptocurrencies. Well, they're actually not cryptocurrencies. They don't have to be on a blockchain. Everything's a ledger of some kind. It doesn't have to be a blockchain. The message traffic is encrypted, but I always say the original cryptocurrency is the US dollar because all that message traffic, it is digital and it is encrypted. So why isn't it a cryptocurrency? Well, it's not the way most people understand cryptocurrencies. But central bank digital currencies are not new currencies, they're new forms or new payment channels, meaning the People's Bank of China, the digital yuan is still a yuan, the digital euro will still be a euro, et cetera. Same thing with sterling and dollars. But what's different is, first of all, the digital form, but you can take it to the point where I could have every US citizen, really anyone in the world could have an account at the Federal Reserve. And I'd have it on my iPhone or my Samsung or whatever. And I could just, push a few buttons and money would go from me to you, or as the case may be. But the point is, there's no MasterCard, there's no 2.5% merchant acquirer fee. You look at a MasterCard transaction, you use it at the point of purchase. The merchant who sold you the goods, they've got a receipt, basically a payable. They sell it to what's called a merchant acquirer. They're just companies that like factors, they buy it all up. The merchant acquirer takes it in a bundle to MasterCard and says, pay me. MasterCard does. MasterCard then sends it through to the issuing bank, the bank that issued my MasterCard in this example. The bank pays MasterCard, and then the bank bills me, and I pay the bank. Well, why do you need 5 intermediaries and 2 or 3% fees to do what I just described when I can have an account at the Fed? And the answer is you can. Our friends that are the modern monetary theorists, the MMT crowd, and the big brain there is Stephanie Kelton. She's a professor at the State University of New York. She's the main economic advisor to Bernie Sanders, who's head of the Senate Budget Committee. So he's in a powerful position. She would say that we don't even need a bond market. These are her words, not mine. It's from her book, The Deficit Myth. She said, well, the only reason the bond market exists, it's a favor to investors. We're giving you a place to put your money as a favor to you, but we don't need it. You could just give Lockheed's wire instructions to the Fed. And when we want to pay $5 billion for a F-22 jet, we just send the money to Lockheed. Who needs the bond market? So this is kind of where it's all going. But then I always say, well, okay, got it. I understand the plumbing. I understand the technology. Why? Why are we doing this? And the answer is, if you're going to slaughter cows, you have to get them in a cattle chute, get them into the slaughterhouse so you can slaughter them. And that's what they're doing to citizens. They want to get us all in the digital cattle chute, into a digital world, no cash, so they can withdraw taxes directly from your bank account. Oh, you voted for the wrong party last time? Well, we're going to freeze your account. Freeze, seize, don't say please, as I put it. And negative interest rates. The easiest way around negative interest rates, again, you have 100,000, sterling, and the government puts on negative interest rates. So you say, okay, notwithstanding the reports, march down to the bank, get your sterling, bury it in the backyard, come back a year later, it's all there. Whereas if you leave it in a bank, you're down, say 1%, so you only have 99,000 in my example. Well, the authorities know that. So they're like, well, we can't have negative interest rates until we get rid of cash, because cash is a workaround to taking money out of digital accounts. So that's one of many examples. And by the way, I say things like this, and I understand them. People go, oh, that'll never happen. I'm sorry, it's already happened. It's not like a near-term forecast. Look at my friend Chrystia Freeland, the neo-fascist deputy prime minister of Canada, also the finance minister, during the Freedom Convoy trucker strike in Ottawa. Now, what did they do? Well, yeah, they blocked traffic. They snarled the city. They honked their horns at 3 a.m. That's all true, but it was completely nonviolent. There was no violence. They went through all the trucks that they confiscated later. They found some guns, but they were unloaded. Very few, by the way, but there were no acts of violence. What did the government do? Those truckers have been arrested. They're being held without bail. They have not had hearings. They were trampled by horses in the street. They were kicked and beaten by the Royal Canadian Mounted Police. But Chrystia Freeland, because the thing in Canada is different. They only have 5 big banks. In the US, we got like 5,000, but there were only 5 banks. She calls the banks, gets the account information, froze all the accounts, then called the crypto exchanges. This is for your any crypto fans who think that this is a workaround. Called the crypto exchanges, again, got the account numbers and froze the crypto accounts, seized the trucks. These people are in jail without bail and they can't feed their families. So don't tell me that this isn't all a means to an end, because it is.
And what do you think that end is? Is that end about control? I mean, obviously it is. But when you refer to they want to do this, they want to do that, who are they?
That's a great question, Isabel. And I always say, we don't have to resort to conspiracy theories. I can name them all. Your friend Mark Carney, I think he's the only guy who's ever been the head of 3 central banks. He was head governor of the Bank of Canada, Bank of England, and then became chairman of the Bank for International Settlements in Basel, Switzerland, which is the central banker's central bank. He's now the head of what do they call GFANZ, taking over the financial system with a green ostensible agenda, really as a way for social control. So he's probably the number 1 guy. But Christine Lagarde, Janet Yellen, she's not that competent, but she'd be on the list. Tim Geithner, Wally Odiamo, who's our sanctions king here in the U.S., and many. It's a long list of people. But my point is, we know who they are. And I always say, you don't have to posit a conspiracy if you have like-minded individuals. As if they all agree, you don't need a conspiracy. They're just going to agree. And so they get together in Davos or Aspen or G7 or wherever it might be and hang out in the hallways and private dinners and all that stuff. But they agree on everything I'm describing. So but to your point, what's the real purpose? This is part of the total surveillance state. And so we're already pretty surveilled. If you have your iPhone on, whatever, Samsung, whatever, they got the GPS, so they know where you are and you should travel about. I recommend what are called Faraday sacks. It's a certain kind of line and you got to get the right one. But if you turn your phone off, put it in the Faraday sack and just close it up, they can't track you. I drive a 14-year-old car with 206,000 miles on it because it doesn't have the modern electronics, the new electronics. So, but it takes some doing. Motorcycles are a good idea, but it takes some doing to avoid surveillance as it is. Like the UK has the most closed circuit TV cameras of any London, and you're always smiling for the camera. But so it's bad enough as it is. But take a digital money system on top of that. And I did some work for this on the intelligence community years ago because we were looking at could you track, because the terrorists washed up, they got rid of their cell phones, they knew that was putting a target on their back, but they still had to get around. Could you track them using credit cards, hotel, whatever? And the answer is it's difficult, but yes. But now with a completely digital money system, it's child's play because it's centralized by the government. So they've got you at the point of purchase. They know what you're buying. And if you're buying a book that they don't particularly approve of, or you're giving, I gave some money to the Canadian truckers for, legal defense and stuff like that. And then the money, there was one that was just a fraud at GoFundMe. They took the money. We're not giving it to the truckers. They raised $9 million in 2 days. We're not giving it to the truckers. Now, bear in mind, this is all to your point about the digital world, right? And but we're going to give it to some worthy cause. So that would be like some left-wing nuts or whatever. But so there's an uproar about that, and then we're going to give it back. But there was another site that came on. I think it's called Give, Send, Go. Same idea, but they're a little more honest, I guess. And I gave them some money, but then the government of Canada. And Trudeau actually isn't smart enough to do everything I'm talking about, but Christy Freeland is a big brain. She really is good at this. She made it a crime in Canada to support the Freedom Convoy. And I don't know if giving money count. I'm in Canada now, so I'm like, hey, Christy, come and get me, But that's the attitude you have to adopt in the world that we're describing. So in China is got the best working prototype. They're the furthest along, but Europe is not too far behind. US is a little further behind, but the point is, this is the last step in the total surveillance state.
James, that's a really good point. I'm going to share your sentiments on a lot of this. I think people who were suggesting this back in 2020 were seen as out there conspiracy theorists. They look more like prophets now, and it does feel interlinked. And it's one of the reasons I've sort of pivoted position on globalism a bit, because it does seem interconnected. And if you look at things like the WHO, what's happening with WEF, and what's happening with individual governments, everything you said seems to be moving in that direction as mission creep. So the next question is that how long do you think the wheels have been in motion on this? And why has this happened? My own theory is it might be connected to a busted flush model of quantitative easing. Do you think that's a factor, that basically the financial model is literally, it's done, and they need to find another way through that, and surveillance would be a convenient tool to do that?
Well, I think the surveillance is an end in itself. You probably go back to 1969, the creation of the SDR, the special drawing right, which is world money. I always say the IMF, I call them transparently non-transparent. And what I mean by that is they actually tell you what they're doing. But there's no dictator or fascist or, kind of evildoer in history who didn't tell you what he was going to do. So what you're supposed to do is believe them, the first thing. But in 1969, what the IMF does, they do stuff and they publicize it, but the jargon is so arcane and technical, et cetera, that unless you're an expert, you actually don't know, or most people don't care. I, happen to get my graduate degree in international economics from a school that is boot camp for the IMF. I didn't join the IMF, but one of my, classmates, not the same year, but went to the same school. Tim Geithner, Madeleine Albright, a lot of people went to this School of Advanced International Studies, and they go to the IMF. So I'm in the kind of odd position of, I really understand it because I've been trained in it and I've done it my whole career, but I'm not on the bandwagon. So I'm kind of the worst nightmare because I'm against the neo-fascist impulse, but I have the technical skills to understand it and rebut it. And that's usually, if you have my training, you're in the club, meaning you're part of this process. But SDR is world money. Like, wow, they just call it world money. Well, that's kind of scary. It's like the Federal Reserve. Americans hate central banks. We had two, and we got rid of both of them. One of them we got rid of in 1812, and the other one we got rid of in 1836. From 1836 to 1913, there was no central bank in the United States. There just wasn't. So then after the panic of 1907, the Rockefeller interest, Rockefeller, Morgan, Stillman, a few others, said, well, we need a central bank because we're ready to get some, we got to get bailed out every 10 years. And if Pierpont Morgan dies, which he did in the meantime, who's going to bail us out? So they started the central bank, but they call it the Federal Reserve. Why didn't they call it the Central Bank of the United States? Well, the answer is Americans hate central banks. Federal Reserve sounds like, an aged whiskey or something, to most people. So they do all this sort of subterfuge, but I think that was world money. They can print it. A lot of people don't realize, I'm enough of a geek. I've actually read the Articles of Association of the IMF, including the provisions related to SDRs. Well, not everyone, but people know in general, they can issue it to the members. So the 189 members of the IMF, they all get their share, but they get shares pro rata based on their capital contributions, which means the United States gets the biggest share of a new issue of SDR. This is printed money. It's just printed world money is what it is. The US gets the biggest share. Query if we actually need it versus countries in Africa that get a tiny little sliver. So they have secondary market trading. One of the interesting things they didn't issue recently, Russia got a decent sized share. And everyone's like, well, we hate Russia. It was like, well, sorry, they're IMF members and they got their bid. So you might start there. Quantitative easing has failed and it always will fail, but the people behind it don't realize that. The Jay Powell, Ben Bernanke, Janet Yellen, they don't really understand monetary economics. They don't really understand how their own system works. But the QE doesn't. And what happens is, how do you do QE? You're the Federal Reserve market desk in New York, and you pick up the phone and online or whatever, and you call Goldman Sachs. They offer me 10-year notes, and they do, and you say, "Okay, done." And Goldman Sachs sends you the 10-year notes, and you send them money that comes out of thin air, and that's called money printing. But what people don't realize is that what does Goldman Sachs do with the money? They give it back to the Fed as excess reserves. So all you're doing is inflating both sides of the balance sheet, but that money is not getting into the real economy. It's not doing anything. The money that does affect the real economy is not the money created by the Fed. It's the money created by the banks themselves when they make you a loan and make me a loan and they credit my account. It's like, okay, there's some real money. I'm going to go spend it or invest it or do something. But that has nothing to do with QE. So QE is a facade. It's like a feel-good talking point. It's like US sanctions on Russia. It sounds good, but they're all totally counterproductive.
Sorry, James, I thought you were about to come in here, and that's a really powerful description of what's happening. Just flipping back to Canada, because I thought that was such a shocking, tangible example of an abuse of government power and everything that you've been predicting. Were you nonetheless surprised by how extreme that was, that kind of freezing of financial assets without any justification really that would withstand scrutiny?
I was. I mean, I predicted it, and I understand why they want the toolkit, but I was actually shocked the way it was used. And I know, Christia, we were, my encounters with her, she's got sharp elbows and she's brainy, but she seemed like a nice person. But man, see her in action, it's like the real fascist side comes out, and that's the point. I know those powers exist, but I didn't think that they would be used that quickly and that aggressively in that fashion. See, what you should, two things. Number one, once this strike started, Trudeau should have come out, said they're trying to gather around, try to have some police or whatever on the perimeter and just listen to them. So hear them out. Well, why are you here? What's your, you kind of know what the beef, what's your beef? And then make a few concessions. And I don't know what, but, just say, okay, I can meet you halfway, or we can ease up on the cross-border thing, or work with the US. You could have done, they would have all said thank you. And they would have all gone home. That would have been the end of it. Instead, he's like a coward. He actually went into hiding. No one knew where he was for 3 days. He was somewhere around Ottawa. It was totally weird, but that's kind of it's very revealing about who he is. He's not a stand-up guy. But Christia is like, she's the real deal. So she's the one who dropped the hammer. And I would have given them all like a summons to appear in court, have a hearing, let them go home, but then have a hearing, maybe $1,000 fine, don't do it again. Worst case, 1 night in jail. Maybe, but even that seems, for first offender, even that seems too much. They've been in jail since this happened in, I think it was in February, or January. They've been in jail since January. So they've already served a 4-month sentence, and some of them are in solitary confinement, not to mention the financial side. But I conduct a seminar at the U.S. Army War College in financial warfare. In fact, I just did it a few weeks ago. And it's at the U.S. Army War College in Carlisle, Pennsylvania, but all branches are represented. It's an elite class, about 12 students. They're mid-career officers, so lieutenant colonels, there was a Navy commander, Air Force pilot, and some civilians. There was one guy from the State Department. These people have been sort of singled out. They're the future policymakers, the future commanders, and so this is part of their career path. And we go into this in a lot of detail. I said at the last, I just said this about 2 weeks ago. I said, well, for the first time in 7 years, we don't have to do hypotheticals. We got a real financial war going on. So let's drill down on what's actually being done. And we did. So I'm kind of immersed in it. But it's one thing to know the weapons and tactics. It's another thing to see them used on basically fairly innocent people.
It seems to me that countries are doing different things at different points over the last 2 years, not just on finance, but connected to the pandemic and so on. But there's an interconnected aspect of digital ID. If you look at the UK's point of view, there's a lot of cloak and dagger legislation that have just gone through or coming down the tracks around digital ID or online security or human rights reforms. But they're interconnected, those bits of legislation. The problem I've got with it is, the bombast of lockdowns, for instance, have gone. It's been replaced by a lot of legislation that the public have no idea of the implications of that, in particular aspects of the digital ID component. And that's different in every country. So my question to you is that we are where we are right now. Where do you think we're going to be with this in the next 2 or 3 years? Is it full steam ahead, or is there any way, for instance, that there can be a roadblock to the forms of the financial reboot through, I suppose, surveillance financial?
Yeah, I think, Jane, I think it's full speed ahead. I mean, show me an example in history where government got more power and they gave it back. What happens is they gather power, and then it collapses. There does come a time when it collapses, but that's a very messy, chaotic process. During the Roman Republic, they had the office of dictator. And dictator wasn't a nasty word the way it is today. What it was a special appointment. They had term limits. You could only be dictator for 2 years. And basically, when things were fine, dictator had no place. But when you're under attack, or here comes Hannibal, or the barbarian, whatever, there's some distress, and you need consolidate. You would appoint a dictator, and then he would kind of get you out of it. Well, we have a law in the United States. It's called the International Emergency Economic Powers Act of 1977, passed during the Carter administration during the Iranian crisis and financial crisis that was coming. It's an update on something called the Trading with the Enemy Act of 1917. By the way, when Franklin Roosevelt confiscated all the gold in the United States in 1933, he said, well, what statutory justification did he have? Well, they cited the Trading with the Enemy Act of 1917. I don't know who the enemy was, must have been the American people. But so this IEPA, International Emergency Economic Powers Act, is an update on that. And of course, I read it, and it basically gives the President of the United States dictatorial powers. So there are only 2 predicates. Number one, it has to be a threat to national security. Well, things are so interconnected. Everything's a threat to national security. And it has to originate abroad. Again, show me something that doesn't have a European or Japanese connection. So the predicates are easily met. And if you invoke it, you are a financial dictator. And all the sanctions that we're seeing with regard to Russia, if you read them, they're all, the statutory authority is exactly what I just described. I don't doubt that the UK has similar emergency legislation, powers, et cetera. And, the same thing in France and Germany and elsewhere. So these things, by the way, a lot of these things have been around since the 1950s. there is something called COG, continuity of government, COG, and they were basically designed for a nuclear war. Like if we have a nuclear war, we're obviously not going to have time to go vote for stuff. We're going to have to run the government, as I said, like with a dictatorship. So all this stuff's on the books. It was for nuclear war, but now it was kind of like a war with everyday people. But these tools are extremely powerful. They're all they're not well understood by the people using them. There is this, kind of going back to Isabel's question, there is this purpose and intent behind it. And they're going down this path, as you described it, to elimination of cash, total surveillance, using finance as a weapon against your own people, as we saw recently in Canada, but we'll see more of it. So that's all true. But this is like, people getting their hands on a nuclear reactor and start pulling the control rods out like they know what they're doing, and all of a sudden the whole thing melts down. They don't actually understand how the financial system works. They have the titles. A lot of them have never worked in the private sector. I mean, Wally Odiano, he's our sanctions king. He's a deputy secretary of the Treasury. I don't know him personally. I don't doubt that he's a nice guy. He's got all the credentials in Yale Law School and so forth. And he was in the National Security Council during the Obama administration. I think he was president of the Obama Foundation. He had like 1 year in the private sector. He carried Larry Fink's briefcase for a year, but that doesn't do you any good because Larry Fink's in a bubble. So he's just in the same bubble with Larry Fink. It's not like running a grocery store. And now he's deputy secretary of the Treasury, and he's charged with sanctions because I promise you, Yellen doesn't understand any of this. She's a labor economist and a statistics geek. So he's slapping these sanctions on, and they're powerful. And by the way, they just pull them out. They've had this stuff all lined up. They've never used it before. Freezing the assets of the Central Bank of Russia, 12th largest economy in the world, largest nuclear power in the world, largest landmass in the world, major producer of everything we need. Okay. But they don't understand the blowback. And I'll give you an example close to home. They kind of go down to Belgravia and see this. So we're seizing, and the UK and the US are seizing all the assets of the oligarchs. So you got your yacht, taking your townhouse in Belgravia, sell your football club, etc. And we're really, socking to the Russians. Putin hates the oligarchs. I mean, this again, Putin's support is the military, the intelligence service, the Orthodox Church, and the people of Russia. That's his base. He hates the oligarchs. He put, now about 12, 13 years ago, he put the head of Yukos in jail on some trumped up tax charge. But the message to the oligarchs was the following: you can keep your money, but don't mess in politics. Don't get in my way, because you'll be in the next cell, if not worse. Okay, and that kind of worked. There was some modus vivendi, but he hates the oligarchs. So we're doing his dirty work for him. He's reveling in the fact that we're punishing the oligarchs. I go, thank you. I couldn't do that myself, but you're doing a great job. And by the way, to the extent that I guess the odds are heading for Dubai, but to the extent that the oligarchs have any degrees of freedom, guess what they're doing? They're taking the money back to Russia. They were trying to get out of Russia for 20 years. All of a sudden, Russia is the safe haven because it's not going to steal. So, okay, we have capital inflows, and you're destroying the class that can threaten me. And Putin should just send a thank you note to President Biden. So it's just, I could give many other examples, but the point is, the people slapping the sanctions on don't understand how they work. Most of them have already boomeranged. They're going to hurt the UK, they're going to hurt the US. The obvious one is higher prices. That's an easy one. But assembly lines are going to shut down. They already have, because some of the parts come from Ukraine. There's something called it's sort of a tube, a plastic tube. There's a name for it, a channel or something. But there are 1,000 miles of wire in a car, in a modern automobile. And you need these channels to run all the wires, so they're not hanging under the dashboard. It's the first thing you put in the chassis before you put the windows and the doors and all the other stuff. When you put this channel in to get the wires right, guess where they come from? Ukraine. So Volkswagen and BMW have already shut down certain assembly lines in Dresden because they can't get this part. Well, that's just one. I mean, just multiply that by the entire supply chain, and you can begin to see what's going on. But it's worse than that. So Ukraine and Russia together produce 25% of the grain exports in the world. Wheat, barley, corn, a few others. So that's a big percentage, yeah. But if you're the importer, for a lot of these countries, they import between 70 and 100% of their grain from those two countries. Lebanon is 100%. Egypt is about 90%. Somalia, Sudan, Kenya, etc. Well, if you're getting 70 to 100% of your grain from Russia and Ukraine, Russia's exports are cut off by the sanctions, Ukraine's exports are cut off because there's a war going on, you're going to starve. So you're going to see late this year, early next year, you're going to see a humanitarian crisis of unprecedented magnitude. More people are going to starve to death and are going to be killed on the battlefield, including sadly civilians. Because the US, Canada, and Australia produce a lot of grain, but we use it ourselves. We use it to feed pigs and cows, and it's animal feed. And if we do have any exports, we already got a customer list. So where's this grain going to come from? It's not. And so and I could cite many wars where, there was shooting going on, but the parties still did financial transactions because it kind of had to. In World War II, the Bank for International Settlements, where I mentioned Mark Carney was hanging out for a few years, based in Basel, Switzerland. In World War II, they brokered Nazi gold. The Nazis would sell the gold to BIS and they would get hard currency, which the Reich used to buy whatever they could buy. The head of the BIS at the time was an American, Tom McKittrick. So here you have an American running a bank brokering Nazi gold in the middle of World War II. He's probably down the street from Allen Dulles. It's probably a two-way street in terms of intelligence, but people were smart enough to know that you can only choke the financial channels so far without hurting yourself.
Yeah. I've got two more questions, very conscious that we're running out of time here in the speakeasy. But your expertise is in predictions. So how long, bluntly, do you give cash? Let's say in the US, where you're generally based, how long is cash going to be around for? And perhaps you could reflect possibly on Europe and the UK.
Well, it's a great question, Isabel, and I'll answer it a little obliquely, which is what do we mean by cash? Now, in terms of a note, paper Bank of England note or a federal treasury note or whatever, maybe not that much longer because they are trying to get rid of it for all the reasons we discussed. But I recommend for Americans that everyone buy a monster box. And a monster box comes from the US Mint. It's a nice treasury green box with a compression strap. It has 500 1-ounce American silver eagles, pure silver. So they're monster box, be about $12,000-$13,000 at the market. You got a battery, flashlights, extra water for the hurricane. Have a monster box. By the way, when the power grid goes down, ATMs don't work, gas pumps don't work, credit cards don't work, Bitcoin doesn't work. And if there's no cash left, how are you going to feed your family? Well, I dare say 3 or 4 1-ounce silver coins will be taken in exchange for food and necessities.
So you've avoided putting a time frame on how long we're going to be using coins and notes. I mean, are we talking another 5 years, 10 years?
No, look, this has got a lot of momentum. It feels like 2 or 3 years. Because once the central bank digital currencies come on, remember, you can't get rid of something until you have a replacement.
Yeah, sure.
And so once the central bank digital currencies come on stream, we're close. Some of them are already out, and we're close on others. And there are more people have iPhones than bank accounts, but you won't need a bank account because you'll have your smartphone. Yeah. And so you got 2 steps. Number 1, get everybody in the world a smartphone. We're pretty close to that. Yeah. And number 2, get the central bank digital currencies rolled out, and we're close to that. When those 2 things are done, they'll eliminate cash. They already, I mean, we got rid of the 500 euro note about 5 years ago, I believe. Yeah. In 1968, until 1968, the United States had a $500 bill, and they were in circulation. And they got rid of that. And then the biggest denomination was a $100 bill. But the $100 bill of 1968 is only worth $20 today in real terms. So we're down to 20s. And so in a way, it's like an ice cube melting. Like, do you really have to eliminate cash if it's not worth much? Here comes inflation. So they're going to get rid of it soon.
So final question is the role of crypto in all of this. And I think you said at the very beginning, you don't have any. I think you said that. Am I right? You don't have any investment?
I don't have any. No, I do not.
So that suggests to me that you don't see that as a kind of, the sort of the future gold, as it were. It's not a reliable fallback plan, or where do you see it in all of this?
Well, my thoughts on it, and it's taken a while. I've studied it for years, 10 years or longer. And it's really taken a long time for me to understand it. I could talk about it, but do I really understand it? And I've sort of viewed it through the lens of communications theories, and we may need another 2-hour interview to do that. But just succinctly, Bitcoin and other cryptocurrencies will not replace the dollar as a reserve currency or a main medium of exchange, but they may destroy the dollar and sterling and all other currencies. And the reason is that we've lost the thread where we don't know what money is anymore. And so Bitcoin has a character I call moneyness. It has some moneyness characteristics, but it's not exactly money. But instead of using that point to sort of disparage it, it's more profound to understand that actually what's happening is no one knows what money is.